Welcome to Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairy Tales. I'm your host, Dr. Alan Christensen. Look, you know that between the latest online fads and the crazy media headlines, it's easier than ever to get confused about your health. And you and I just want to feel better and live longer. We want to know what works. And we can't wait for further studies. We need to make decisions today based on the best evidence we've got. Well, that's exactly what this show is here for. So let's get to it.
Hi there, this is Dr. Linda Kashaba from Integrative Health. Would you like some help with your thyroid? We would absolutely love to help you out. And guess what? We can even do remote care. Please call us today at 480-657-0003 to set up your first appointment. If you mention code podcast20, you will get 20% off from your first visit. That phone number again is 480-657-0003, and the code is podcast20. Can't wait to meet you.
What's the best way to fuel your active body and your active muscles? Are carbs going to give you more energy, or is fat? Do you have to choose? Is one better than the other? This is a super important topic, and it's been talked about in its relevance to athletics, but also in terms of just day-to-day energy and overall health. I was really happy to spend some time with Matt Fitzgerald and speak to him about this topic. He's an acclaimed endurance sports author, coach, and nutritionist. Tons of great books out there. One of my favorites is The Endurance Diet. He's worked with pro level and Olympic athletes for well over a decade, and he knows what works based upon what the best are doing. So we had a discussion about this topic and got quite a bit more into fats, carbs, healthy diet, what are some of the main facets to think about, the importance of food variety, and just the experience he's had seeing how this plays out with the world's best athletes. And again, if you're not the world's best, which I'm sure not, and maybe you're not even focusing on your athletics, but we all want to have more energy output. We all want to get more from our health and figure out the best diets that can achieve that. So please enjoy the discussion I had with Matt Fitzgerald. Hey, Dr. C here with you, and super glad to be joined with Matt Fitzgerald. Matt, welcome to the show.
Hey, great to be on it.
Hey, so I've followed your work for some time and been a real big fan of it. And, you're no stranger to this whole contentious issue we're talking about. I want to take just 1 second and read the question that pushed me over the edge and made me want to reach out to you. So, hi, Dr. C. Thank you for all the helpful information you put out. I've recovered from Hashimoto's and I'm able to exercise and happy about that. I want to do a 10K run this year, but all my friends say I have to go keto. I'm afraid I'll throw off my thyroid if I do. Should I quit running, or what can I do? So I saw that one and I said, shoot, I've got to do like a myth-busting discussion about carbs and fats for performance. So here we are.
Yeah, this is a popular topic these days, and it seems like no matter how often I talk and write about it, there are still people out there like the friends of the person who wrote that question who are still all in on keto.
And I've had other friends reach out. There was another one within the last 3-4 months. This was someone who was getting into cycling. They were going to do their first century pretty soon, and it was not so much concerns about keto, but thinking they had to go keto for performance. And this person was a husband of a woman who's, a super big health author. So this is getting really pervasive out there, keto and low carb in general.
Yeah. It is a source of frustration to me because, it's, as a sports nutritionist and endurance sports writer, that's not the direction I steer athletes. So it's frustrating because I care deeply about helping athletes perform better, and, to have to be kind of swimming against a strong current in terms of some of the information I'm offering that I really think is valuable makes me pull my hair out.
Could you take just a moment and tell us about your experience with the world-class athletes, how you've come to see what really works for them and kind of what that arc has been to bring you to your current conclusions?
Yeah. So, I am, I'm an athlete myself. I started running when I was 11 years old. I'm 48 now, so I've been at it for a long time. And when I started I got away from running a little bit. I quit at the end of high school, didn't run in college, then got back into it seriously, as well as triathlon in my late 20s. And when I did that, I was also working as an endurance sports journalist. I got a couple years out of college, I got a job with a startup triathlon magazine. And when I got serious about improving my own performance, and did so in the context of sort of, this magazine I was writing for, and interviewing a lot of elite athletes, just being around them at events, just for the sake of trying to maximize my own performance. My kind of common sense instinct was emulate the pros, train like the pros, eat like the pros, think like the pros, prevent injuries like the pros. And, I considered, these sports they've been around a long time, and the stakes are very high. So people, no matter how talented you are, you're not going to get to the top and stay at the top by doing things wrong. So my perspective was, these folks probably know what they're doing. And if I want to, get the most out of myself, I should do what they do. And it started, that's 20 years ago now, 20 plus, that I just started emulating the pros. And then when I got into coaching later, I had the same philosophy. And so I started to see myself as as a coach and a writer, as a conduit between the best practices as exemplified by the elites and the masses. Science has a role in there too, but I think too many, quote unquote quote experts focus too much on science. Science is great, but it is really limited in its real world applicability. When you're talking about, sort of real world problem solving, which, maximizing your endurance performance really is a case of. So, but that's been kind of my shtick ever since, just emulate the pros. And then, with nutrition, it's just evolved over time. I know we're going to be talking about my book, The Endurance Diet, which came out a couple years ago, where I really just try to lay out my best case that everyday endurance athletes should eat the way elite endurance athletes do.
I think a point that I'd love people to really get is that these sports have gone on for some time, and at this top level of performance, if there was any low-hanging fruit, it would have been found. So any way in which these people could radically differ from what others are doing, if, for example, a radical shift in diet was going to lead to a change in performance or improvement, that would be embraced and everyone would do that. There's almost a thought that, they don't know this or they don't know that. And you've more than probably most of it, any of us, you've seen just how much effort these people are putting in to squeeze out every possible advantage they can find.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the many kind of soft arguments I see people make in favor of, the ketogenic diet for endurance athletes is that, the pros are sort of hidebound and stuck in tradition and afraid to try anything new. And that could not be farther from the truth. They are so ready to innovate, but, they're also not stupid, and they have a lot at stake. And, when your livelihood depends on your performance, you're not just going to try any old thing. You are constantly looking for a leg up on your competition with new methods. But you're going to be extremely selective in those you actually choose to give a try. So, there are great recent examples of, newer methodologies that have penetrated, the elite echelon of endurance sports lately. And keto diets are not one of them, because people at that level, they don't believe that, they believe it's a risk not worth taking. And the very few who have tried have typically crashed and burned on those diets.
Had there been some public examples of that, or?
Yeah, I mean, yes. The one that I talk about, or I guess share her example in The Endurance Diet, is Georgia Gould. her career is winding down now, but she's an Olympic medalist for the United States in mountain biking. And she sort of got, I think she just read one of the popular, low carb diet books and thought, well, I'll give it a shot. And it was just a disaster for her. I mean, the bottom dropped out from under her, not only just in terms of performance and training, but also her health as well. And so, she realized that was a terrible idea. Also, she just hated it. And maybe we can get into that more too. It's not all just the physical side, the psychological side, the lifestyle side matters a lot too. And there's some pretty strong negatives there. But anyway, Georgia just decided, okay, this didn't work, went back on a moderate to high carb diet, or what I call a carbohydrate centered diet. And immediately she was back to her old self.
And you mentioned about how there's just people put too much focus on science, and in a smaller sense, there's ways in which you could take plausible sounding arguments about models and mechanisms, or you could pull out some rather outlying human studies, or more commonly animal studies, and you can make an argument for most anything. And I just love to hit a few of those points. So some argue, shouldn't fat be a superior fuel just because fat has more energy per gram? There's less blood sugar fluctuations. It's a denser fuel. So what about those arguments?
Yeah, I mean, there is a higher energy yield per gram of fat than there is from either protein or carbohydrate. The thing is, it actually fat is also at the same time a lot less efficiently metabolized. So it for endurance athletes, it takes more oxygen to aerobically metabolize fat. So what happens is, obviously, oxygen is your most precious commodity when you're engaging in endurance training or racing, and you want to be able to use oxygen as efficiently as possible. There are a million ways you can maximize the efficiency of you can increase your supply, by increasing your aerobic capacity. That's great. But within the limits of your VO2 max, you want to be able to use oxygen as efficiently as possible. Something as simple as weight loss helps with that. If you ride a bike, dialing in your time trial position can help you, save more energy and put more oxygen into actual forward propulsion. And then metabolically, what the research on low carb and ketogenic diets has shown is that it actually lowers VO2 max, because your body can only process so much oxygen. And if you go on a ketogenic diet, your muscles become more dependent on fat for fuel, and it just simply takes more oxygen to break down that fuel and turn it into forward propulsion. So it effectively, you become metabolically less efficient. You're sort of wasting oxygen. You're using more oxygen in order to go the same speed as before you made the mistake of going on a ketogenic diet. So, in sort of lay terms, you can think of your body as, a transmission with 5 gears. When you go on a ketogenic diet, you lose 5th gear. You lose overdrive. Wow. It's gone.
That's a great way of putting that. Completely losing a gear, requiring more oxygen. So as if you were just breathing harder, less utilization and less ability to generate fuel. And
yeah. Or it's almost, you could think of it as almost you suddenly gained 15 pounds,
Oh, wow. And I guess another side about that too is there's arguments about how fat is useful with the context of other fuels, and it is, but fat is something that, we're not going to run out of anytime soon.
Right.
The leanest of us have quite a bit of that on hand as we need access to it.
Yeah. One of the, the concepts that's out there that, leads to a lot of confusion about, how exactly you should eat and fuel for performance is this idea of lasting energy. Like you want, and it makes sense, right? If you're doing any kind of endurance race, a marathon or an Ironman triathlon, you want your energy to last, but the thing is, you also want fast energy. And when you're actually, sort of pushing yourself, not just trying to cover a certain distance, but trying to cover it quickly, more sustained energy often is slower energy, and your muscles end up in sort of a deficit state, like they're begging for the energy they need to maintain a certain speed, and the supply is not coming quickly enough because, for example, if you just look at, within the realm of carbohydrates, consuming, during an event, complex carbs versus simple sugars. Simple sugars lead to better performance because they're faster. And so the idea that you want lasting energy is kind of a myth. I mean, you do, but you sort of take care of that simply by getting fit, and just having the fitness it takes to cover a certain distance, and with your everyday diet leading up to the last meal you consume before an event. But once you're moving along, like you cannot supply exogenous energy sources as quickly as your muscles need them. So you want just the fastest energy you can possibly get, not necessarily lasting. The way you make it lasting is just by continuing to take it in.
By having more of it and certain frequencies. And
exactly.
So there's also a thought that if you can almost train your body. If you're only consuming fat, then your body only burns fat, and that somehow you'll flip a switch and now all of your stored fat will just be melted. And yeah, it doesn't quite pan out that way.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at, just take, the Boston Marathon and look at the entire field of 30,000 or however many runners compete in it each year. The winner, the person who crosses the finish line first out of those 30,000, will have burned the most energy, will have burned energy at the highest rate of anyone in the field. And the person who finishes last probably will have burned energy at the slowest rate. So what you really want to do, it's like, no one's given medals for how much fat they're able to burn. Maybe someday there will be fat burning competitions, but right now it's just how fast can you cover 26.2 miles. And what it takes to do that is actually the capacity just to burn energy in general. So what you really want to be good at is burning both fat and carbohydrate. If you look at that winner of the Boston Marathon, that's what he is doing. And if you take the female winner, same deal. They're really good at burning fat and they're really good at burning carbs. The idea that you just only want to be good at one just doesn't make any sense, given the fact, again, that medals aren't given out for fat burning capacity. So what happens is if you go on a ketogenic diet, yes, you get really good at burning fat. You also get really terrible at burning carbohydrate, so that your capacity to burn, to maximize the total rate of energy expenditure goes down. You're just sort of like, do another automotive metaphor, that you're just taking 20 or 25 horsepower off your engine. You just want, there's no good or bad source of energy. You just want the energy when you're a competitive athlete.
And many who are thinking about just their general health may watch markers of glucose utilization, their blood sugar, their A1C, these various things, and they may think that if they do extreme deprivation of carbohydrate, those things can get better. But as you said, they become less able to burn it because they're not consuming it. So in some cases, they can see better metrics because there's just less carbohydrate being processed. In many cases, people can often see worse metrics because their body is forming more carbohydrate from muscle tissue than they would have utilized from food. But at the end of that, yeah, they've gotten actually worse at being able to burn reasonable amounts that they need for maintenance.
Yeah. I mean, you see this in all kinds of ways. People, there's a tendency to want to find, a silver bullet, just like one thing that is the answer. And, really maximizing endurance performance is, you need all the tools. So yeah, it's great to be good at burning fat, but there's also a bunch of other things you want to address too. And you see people doing it on, the training side too. Like they'll just, one type of workout, they'll settle on as, the only one that matters. And that's not a good idea. You just want to keep all the tools at play.
And a great point that you've made in your work is that these are things that are just, really unarguably relevant to the world's best athletes. But given that these things affect how the body performs when it's really at the limit of performance, this is important to everyday exercisers, just those who are doing things in a more recreational sense too. Yeah.
Another, when I give a presentation or a seminar or whatever, and hammer home these points in front of a live audience and then take questions, I'll often, there's always a skeptic or two in the room. And one of the skeptical questions I often get is, okay, fine, you've made your point that, a carbohydrate centered diet is better for elite athletes, but like elite athletes are so genetically different from us and they train at so much higher volumes that, how can that possibly be relevant to me? I'm a 25-minute 5K runner or what have you. But people really have a skewed sense of how different elite athletes are from the rest of us. First of all, on the genetic side, there's only a small handful of genes that have been identified that distinguish, elite talent from everyone else. And those genes actually have nothing at all to do with how food is digested and metabolized. It's just like,
well, they're also rather common genes, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. Really, the ones that matter have to do with just raw speed. You just need to be, you need to be a good sprinter to be a good endurance athlete, and that is genetic. And then, aerobic capacity, or what I call walking around fitness. If you take 1,000 people without any training at all and have them, run a mile as fast as they can, some people will do remarkably well on no training, and that is genetic as well. And then also just body type. Some people are just, they've got that like sort of avian bird-like build, just like super, just efficiently put together. Those are kind of the three things, and there are genes that underlie all those things. It should be said though that if you take, all the bona fide world-class endurance athletes in the world and then look at their genomes, they're all over the place. There's as much diversity genetically among elite athletes as there is among everyone else. So there's no single way to, there's no single, genetic recipe for elite endurance talent. And then on the training volume side, you just have to be, there's sort of absolute and relative definitions of how elite athletes train. Like, the typical elite marathon runner runs 120 miles per week. That doesn't mean you have to run 120 miles per week in order to train like a pro. What you have to do is train at high volume relative to your limits. That's the relative definition of what these athletes are really doing. So it's just a matter of, yes, you're not that genetically different from the pros. So yes, you can and probably should eat like them. Do you need 5,000 calories a day as someone who exercises 45 minutes a day? No, but that's just a matter of scaling. It doesn't call for, just completely ignoring how the pros eat and doing something almost as if you're a different species from them. Whatever they do, I'll do the opposite because, they're made out of, space materials.
Well, and back to the training volume, many think about that as if it's like the ultimate get out of jail free card, and that anything you do wrong doesn't matter because of the training volume. And I think one could argue that the volume is as much of a liability as it is an asset.
That's exactly right. Because you really are, if your livelihood depends on your performance in races, you have to train at your limit. You have to kind of take risks in terms of how much your body can handle. And so, people sort of forget, like, being an elite athlete is not about looking good naked. It's about being able to beat the Kenyans, and so if your perspective is, and it's understandable, if you're not an elite athlete, you've never been around them, it's understandable that, if you take, Joe or Jane, elite runner who's running 120 miles a week, and you put that person on, a McDonald's diet, they will still look good naked. So, you know what I mean? They will burn all those calories and they will still have a lean body composition and they'll look good. But that's not what they're trying to do. So the idea that they're getting away with that bad diet is nonsensical, because you're measuring the wrong thing. What they care about is how hard can they train, how quickly can they recover, how well can they avoid injury, and then how well can they perform in key workouts and races. And an elite athlete training 120 miles a week on a McDonald's diet will definitely pay a price in terms of all those things that actually matter. So, no, you can't get away with it. It does matter.
One thing that was memorable to me from the Endurance Diets book was about how many athletes have gone through a cycle to where their first few levels of advancement probably was based upon raw talent. Maybe they did really well in high school, and then they started getting serious about training, and that took them a bit further. But in many cases, then when they would enter the real world-class arenas, the talent and the training, many of them had just, really not thought out any dietary habits and just ate default random foods. And because of their talent, initially their training, they could come to a certain point. But at that world-class level, then that was no longer adequate. They had to raise the bar in their diet as well.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, if you just take, a professional endurance athlete at random and just learn the story of their diet, from birth through childhood through, high school and college and beyond, that's the story every time. They grow up eating just like everyone else. They kick butt in their youth by virtue of their talent. And then they get to the point where they're trying to beat the Kenyans and they start losing for the first time, because everyone's talented once you get to that level. And then that's when athletes with both, training, diet, and anything else that could possibly help, that's when they start to look at fine tuning. It's okay, what can I still do to get better? And, if you're just, someone who say, started running in your mid 30s and you kind of get into it, but you let yourself go before then. And so you're carrying around maybe, an extra 20 pounds, you're not super fit. You're at the beginning of the journey. You have a long way to go. It's pretty easy to convince that person, well, here's what you need to do. You need to eliminate all carbohydrates from your diet. And that will get you to the promised land, because that person has so far to go. It feels like, it is going to take something radical to get where I want to go. But you're not going to be able to convince a 24-year-old, young professional endurance athlete who has, who did the sport in high school, who did it in college, and has been at a high level, the whole time, and is mostly doing things the right way. And they're just trying to eke out, the last 2.5% of their genetic potential to get to the Olympics or just to get that new shoe contract or whatever. So that person, that's exactly why you don't see these athletes leaping over to any type of radical diet, because they're like, why would I need to do something radical when I'm almost there? And
wow.
And also, these folks are in a milieu of other elite athletes, right? That's who they train with. Those are their peers. And when they look around at those people, especially the ones who are 3 or 4 years older, the ones who have been winning, the people who are where that young pro wants to be, they don't see them on keto diets. So when they make, they're perfectly willing to do whatever it takes, to get that last 2 or 3% out of themselves. But their sense of, they're going to be coldly rational in that decision making. And so, if they're going to make a change, they want to make the right change the first time. And so these people are not going to go to Barnes and Noble, pick up some, ketogenic diet book and start following it. They're just going to talk to their teammate who just won a national championship and say, hey, I noticed you eat this, that, and the other thing. Like, why? And, that might lead to the changes that take them to the next level.
That 30-year-old person that you put out in that example who could get swayed by some of the direction, perhaps they are on just too much food in general, a lot of processed food, and a lot of default diets are, 40 to 60% carbohydrate. So if someone is overeating and they've got a lot of processed food and they end up cutting out a lot of processed carbohydrate, they may see some initial weight loss and they may end up being on a higher quality diet by just being deliberate about their foods for the first time. So they often can see some perhaps initial gains, but then as the diet becomes more limited, they become more compromised.
Yeah. Something that happens that I see all the time is, an athlete will choose to go low carb, and they, after a period of time, decide that they're satisfied with the results. Hey, I lost weight. Hey, I can go. My training's better. Hey, I set a PR in this or that race. And then they'll say, see, carbs are bad. I just proved it. And what I tell these folks is, you've thrown out the baby with the bathwater. Like, if you had simply cut out low quality carbs and maintained or even increased your high quality carbohydrate sources, you would have gotten even better results. I promise. But you see that all the time. People when they're doing a lot of things wrong, if they take a sledgehammer approach to making changes, they can improve. There's a blog post I wrote a few months back. The title of it was something like, just because something works doesn't mean something else couldn't work better. And, you see that all the time, again, both on the training side and the dietary side.
They might make half a dozen changes and 4 of them were good ideas. 1 was neutral and 1 was terrible. And it might have looked like it was a good outcome.
Yeah. Just, another, just to give, an example, CrossFit's another one. CrossFit, you see a lot of athletes who are sort of, maybe they're not strength training and they take up something, it could be CrossFit or just something else like it. And they feel like, hey, I don't get injured as much anymore. I'm stronger. And again, I tell them, you've thrown out the baby with bathwater. Like, it's good that you started strength training, but what you should have done is, started strength training exactly with the way the pros do, which, a CrossFit workout, you're doing some things that are good for runners. You're also doing some things that are irrelevant for runners, and also some things that are not good for runners. So on balance, you may make progress and decide, see, every runner should do CrossFit. But in fact, you need a counterfactual. You needed your exact, genetic twin to have started strength training also, which every runner should do, but done it the way the pros do. And then you would have seen that, just because CrossFit worked doesn't mean something else wouldn't have worked better.
I'd love to start going deep into some of the facets of the endurance diet. And if you could just tell us, like, what your discovery process was like, if there was a certain time frame or certain, situations in which became clear about these patterns, but kind of how it all unfolded for you about there was just these recurrent themes.
Yeah. So, as I intimated before, I started trying to eat like the pros almost 20 years ago. But just in sort of a, not in just sort of an informal way. I just made general observations about how these folks ate and copied them. As I, eventually I got a certification in sports nutrition. I wrote more about the topic. I just got deeper and deeper in it. I started to sort of try to formalize my observations more. And, to be clear, I'm not a scientist. And to the degree that I try to be a scientist, I'm a poor one. But still, for this project, I decided to, do the best I could. And what I did was I traveled to different parts of the world and just sat down and ate with Kenyan runners in Kenya, with Olympic cross-country skiers in Canada, with professional triathletes in Brazil. The Japanese runners I ate with were actually in Boulder, Colorado. I've never been to Japan. I would love to have gone, but they actually came to me in this instance, or close enough. And then I also created, because I couldn't travel everywhere, so I created a survey that I sent out to as many elite endurance athletes in as many disciplines, in as many parts of the world as I could possibly cover. I just pulled every string to try and just get a large body of data. And, I already knew more or less generally what I would find, because I wasn't starting from zero. But I was still open to just, for example, if I saw a ton of vegetarians, I would have reported, hey, a lot of elite endurance athletes are vegetarians. In fact, almost zero were, as it turned out. So, yeah, I just, the way it all shook out was I identified 5 habits that I saw being practiced close to universally among this, special rarefied population.
I want to just briefly touch on those, but I'm highly going to encourage the Endurance Diet book for the listeners. I'll have links to this in the show notes. It's very specific for endurance athletes, at least as it suggests. But honestly, I couldn't recommend it higher as just a general maintenance diet book for people. One of the first concepts in it, the first one about eating everything, I think is a super important message. There's been this whole trend over this last, however long the pop health space has been active in the internet, to where it's like low-hanging fruit to find some demon in the diet that you thought was healthy, but really is going to kill you. And here's why. And so now almost everything has been treated in that capacity, and people have cut out so many categories of food. So the first principle you had is that you saw that these athletes, they didn't do that, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that was one of the most striking observations I saw, was that the elite endurance athletes go out of their way to make their diet as inclusive as they possibly can, to the point of one of the things it's one of the kind of, just weird little wrinkles in the diet of these athletes. They do a lot of bowl type meals, and they will put an insane combination of different types of foods that really you wouldn't think belong together into a bowl. And the whole point is they're trying to leave no stone unturned. And, the rationale is, not a lot of them are actually, educated, super educated nutritionally, but, just sort of their lay perspective on it is that different types of foods check different boxes. There's no one type of food that gives me everything I need. So, I just want to just combine everything. I'll give you one example. So 2 summers ago, I lived and trained with a team of professional runners in Flagstaff, Arizona. And I lived with one of the runners on that team, a guy named Matt 212 marathoner. And he was one of these bowl guys. So, I'm going to describe the first or second morning I was there for 13 weeks. He ate a breakfast bowl, and I'm just going to list the ingredients that it contained because I wrote them down. It had almond milk, coconut water, acai, blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, beet, banana, kiwi, dragon fruit, maple dream granola, honey, coconut, almond butter, and organic vanilla protein powder.
Holy mackerel. That's like a dozen ingredients.
Yeah, and he would have like, a quinoa and kale type bowl, for lunch or dinner, again with another like 20 ingredients in it. Of course, not all of them do that, but that's what I saw consistently again and again. Like, there was virtually none of these athletes avoided any type of food or try to minimize any specific nutrient. That overall, their orientation was exactly the opposite. It's like, I want a well-rounded, inclusive, balanced diet that has absolutely everything in it. And when I say everything, I'm also talking about sweets and alcohol and the occasional treat, of some sort. Like they didn't try to be perfect. So when I say everything, I mean everything.
Mm. There's also another great book you've got out called Diet Cults, which I'd also recommend for the listeners. And this is a deeper dive into how we've gotten fearful of food and how that often takes on elements of just morality and almost ethics where it really doesn't need to. But yeah, we always hear about the importance of variety in the diet, but I think people often ignore the idea of variety at that macro level of food category. Variety is not just 3 kinds of greens, it's really covering those categories.
Yeah. In Diet Cults, I sort of go into, why is it that most, fad diets, popular diets are about restriction? And I trace it to the concept of taboo. Almost all cultures throughout history have had taboo foods, like foods that you can't eat. And, in most cases, the taboos had nothing to do with whether the food is good or bad for you. It was just a way for a culture to define itself.
Tribal identity.
We are the tribe that doesn't eat X.
Yeah.
If you want to eat X, go find another tribe.
Those people do, and they're terrible, and we wouldn't do that, and you'd be ostracized if you did that.
Exactly. And it's still with us. Now we still have taboos, and we think they're scientific, but they're not so much.
Just in general, there's so many arguments about certain foods being bad, and then also evidence about the benefits of many food categories, especially plant foods. And when I look down and really drill into the research, I never find the evidence about the bad side being the least bit compelling. But most of the groups, the culture, we want to call it, they've often got 2 facets. There's the things that you shouldn't do and the things you should do. And the cases for the foods that they'll recommend including are usually pretty strong and solid. But yeah, I just don't find real evidence about any of the foods that we would have put on the table 100 years ago being dangerous things.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's so many fallacies out there. And a while ago, I wrote another blog post. Can't remember what the title was, but it was something like the case against eating plants. And what I did there is like, the point I made there is that pick any food or food category you want, and you can find a flaw in it. You can find, you name it, all of them. Even like whatever you think the greatest food on the world is, if you study it, it has something wrong with it, some kind of negative. And so what a lot of people do when they're too quick to stop eating a food because they've been persuaded that something is wrong with it is that if you took that logic all the way, you would stop eating everything, because every single, I'm talking about, the natural food types out there that humans have been eating for eons. They all have pluses and minuses, but on balance, they're all good. That's why they've been in the human diet for eons. And also it's worth saying that, there's some pretty compelling research showing that there's sort of a synergistic or almost gestalt-like effect that of combining disparate food types. So, nuts and seeds are good, and vegetables are good, but actually when you combine them, it's more than the sum of the parts in terms of there's an additive effect. So that's why, a lot of the scientific measures of, how different food types are combined. So that's part of the reasons you want an inclusive diet, where nothing is forbidden.
That's fascinating. I've heard people argue that we often try to reduce what's good or bad to foods down to certain elements or constituents. Like, tomatoes are good because they have lycopene or whatever else. And I've heard some make a real strong, clear, cogent case against that, saying that no, when we see studies saying that people eat tomatoes and they have this outcome, the only active ingredient you can really isolate is tomatoes. The active ingredient in tomatoes is tomatoes. And from what you're saying, you could take that further and say the active element of a healthy diet is a healthy diet.
Yeah. Or, just to put it in terms of your own example, like a tomato is better for you if you also eat nuts. Yeah. So it's people are not very good at systemic thinking, where, the idea that, there can be sort of emergent benefits that are great, that make something greater than the sum of the parts. But that really is the case with diet. And, reductive thinking comes much more easily to most people. But, if you just look at, the science that is out there, that's what you see. And again, it's just like, context is everything.
That really segues into the next principle you mentioned about just eating quality, focusing the diet upon not being perfect in a certain way, but trying to really elevate the quality of that. And you also made a really good app people can use to help just get a sense of what their overall diet quality is as well.
Yeah. So, most people, when they think of diet quality, they think of like, a good cut of beef versus a mediocre cut of beef, or like a fine dining restaurant where you get quality food versus a fast food restaurant where you get low quality food. But scientists have a different definition of quality for food. And it's really an outcome based or functional definition. Like if in epidemiological research, it is shown that eating a certain type of food is associated with more positive health outcomes, by definition, that is considered a high quality food type. So, there's a tendency to want to isolate certain characteristics of foods that determine whether they're good or bad. And all of those attempts just break down at one point or another. And so, what the scientists who focus on diet quality do is they just dispense with all that. They don't care what these foods have in common. They don't care if they don't have anything in common. They just see if it's good for you or not. Like, does it make you healthier or not? And if it makes you healthier, it's high quality, no matter what the characteristics of that food type are. And so I got interested in this concept of diet quality. There are different measures out there, like even like there's a formalized Mediterranean diet scale. That is like one definition of diet quality. And there are some others out there. They're all pretty similar because, well, they ought to be, because only certain things are good for you. But they're a little unwieldy they're meant to be used for these big studies. And so I wanted to create a scale that was just useful to athletes, everyday athletes who didn't have a lot of scientific training. So that's where my diet quality score comes from. It's a little like counting calories, a little like food journaling, but simpler than both, because food types are just assigned a score. With the high quality types that are associated with positive health outcomes, giving you points, positive points, and then low quality food types, subtracting points. The nuance is that how many points you get for eating a given type of food depends on how many times you've already eaten it that day. The law of diminishing returns. Like, is it that much healthier to eat 12 servings of vegetables a day versus 11? No. So yeah, so it's really easy to use and just super helpful, because one thing is people tend to look at their own diet through rose-colored glasses, and again, there's plenty of science showing this is the case too. Like, everyone thinks they're already eating pretty healthy, and yeah. And almost everyone isn't. So one of the things this tool does is it forces you to be real with where your diet currently is quality wise, and then you can sort of systematically improve it. And I try to make the point that perfection is not the goal. You just want to like see where you are, and then raise your overall diet quality. And there are there's a short list of simple ways to do that. And then once you're getting the results you want, there's no reason, to try to move any further toward perfection unless you just feel like it.
And the diet qualities discussed in the Endurance Diet book, we'll also get links to the app in the show notes. Then you talk about carb-centered, having carbohydrates be a big part of the diet.
Yeah, again, I know this is a minefield, but don't kill the messenger. I did the research, and I found that pretty much universally elite endurance athletes maintain a carbohydrate-centered diet. I chose that term very mindfully. The obvious choice would have been high carb, but then you get into like, how do you quantify it, and
how high is high? And yeah,
right, exactly. Are we talking absolute grams? Are we talking like percentage of total calories? Or I just wanted to I wanted to keep it qualitative, also because I think if in terms of if you're trying to emulate what the pros do, there's actually no reason to count how much carbohydrate you consume. Like the pros themselves don't do it except in specific circumstances. For example, when they might be doing a 1-day carbohydrate load before, an ultra marathon, they'll actually count just to make sure they're getting enough carbs on a day when they're truly trying to maximize their carb intake. Otherwise, their carb intake is just done as a matter of habit. And what carbohydrate centered really means is simply that high quality carbohydrate rich foods are included in almost all meals and snacks. And that's all it is.
And then you also talked along the lines about them not so much counting or tracking as often as eating enough. And many who are training hard can fail to fuel properly and not recover well and not train at their best.
Yeah, this is one of those areas, in terms of, we've obviously quality matters, but also quantity does too. No matter who you are, athlete or non-athlete, you want to eat the right amount of food from one day to the next, not too little, not too much. In affluent, 21st century societies like ours, where overeating is rampant, we tend to lose sight of the fact that you can also undereat. And when you're an endurance athlete, actually undereating is more problematic than overeating. Like if you're just, a Joe or Jane marathoner and you're a little bit overweight and your diet is, could stand some improvement. But, you're motivated to train, but you're just not motivated to eat better. The consequences of that will be, well, you're very well fueled for your workouts, your training, because you're eating too much. You will tend to not really, you tend to recover okay, because again, nutrients are the raw materials for recovery. You will not have, unless you're a runner who's quite a bit overweight, you won't be at any additional risk for injury, because again, you're getting all the nutrients by virtue of overeating that you need to repair your muscles and bones and connective tissues. The only real negative of, and I'm not talking about out of control overeating, I'm just talking about like garden variety, average American overeating. The only consequence for an endurance athlete is that you will show up at the start line weighing more than your optimal racing weights. You won't perform as well. But if you chronically undereat as an endurance athlete, even if it's just by a little bit, which is extremely common, you will tend to train poorly. I mean, you won't feel good in your training generally. You will gain fitness more slowly because, again, nutrients are the raw materials for adaptations to training stress. Your injury risk will be higher. Your risk of getting sick, especially in periods of extremely heavy training, is higher. So chances are, you might get to your racing weight, but you probably won't even make it to the start line of the race you're training for. So you really want to thread the needle as an endurance athlete and be as careful of avoiding eating too little as eating too much. And that might sound scary because you think, okay, my God, I have to nail my daily caloric intake, to the 10th of a calorie. But what you find is what the elite athletes do is they don't count calories. They eat by feel. There's this idea that we can't trust our hardwired, innate appetite regulatory mechanisms that evolved over eons. But that's hogwash. I mean, nature's not stupid. Like, if hawks in the wild know how much to eat, if every human infant knows when to stop eating, and they all do, then we as adults can too. The only problem is that, those internal signals that tell us when to eat, how much to eat, when to stop, we override them just through social influences, this so-called obesogenic culture we live in. But there's good research showing that just about anyone can learn to reconnect and sort of tune out the external influences, reconnect with the internal ones. And it's really good news because you can thread the needle. You can eat the right amount of food simply by listening to your body and not going through the very fraught exercise of, and inaccurate when it comes down to it, exercise of counting calories.
I'm trying to always get it right on. And and the last thing you mentioned is about just how even with that, there's a lot of room for individualization, and people can find ways in which their personal needs have some diversity and they can learn to work within that.
The story I like to tell in that regard is when I went to Spain and I spent a few days with actually a Dutch professional cycling team. They were at, sort of a winter training camp in southern Spain. And there were, I think, 16 members of the team there. There were a few others that were racing in Australia at the time. And they all ate all their meals together. And they actually brought a lot of their food from the Netherlands. They had their own chef. I mean, it was a high budget pro cycling team, so they had a lot of resources. And, I would sit down at the dinner table with these athletes, 16 of them. And even though they were all getting their food from the same source, and eating together, when I looked around, no two athletes had exactly the same items on their plate. And when I quizzed them about, well, hey, why are you eating this and not that? They all had well thought out reasons for it. And most of it was just based on, one of the things that people maybe underappreciate about what's different about these world-class athletes is that they're extremely tuned into their bodies. They're just really, really good at listening to their bodies, and they know the value of paying attention. So they're always looking for cause and effect and troubleshooting. If anything goes wrong, anything, an injury, an illness, just a period of stagnation in their fitness development, they don't just chalk it up to that's life or bad luck. They look for an answer. And so they all do this on a dietary level. They don't obsess or, worry about food all the time. But if something doesn't seem to agree with them food wise, they stop eating it or look for an alternative. And if something on the flip side, if something seems to work nutritionally for them, they keep doing it. And so what you'll find is, they're all doing, those first four habits that we discussed are sort of one size fits all, like everyone is doing them at this level. But then within those parameters, you see people sort of going on their own journey. There was one professional cross-country skier that I met in Canada, and he was sort of late in his career. He was maybe, I think, 33, 34. He'd been at it since he was a teenager. And we talked about his whole history of eating. And there was an evolution there. Like the way he ate at 34 wasn't the same as the way he ate at 28, which wasn't the same as he ate at 22. And it was just because he was discovering, he was just trying to fine tune and move his diet again, without, keeping himself up at night, worrying about it, but just trying to move closer and closer to a perfect diet for himself. And so that's a worthwhile sort of mindset for each of us, is that, start with the universals. We're all human, and basically the same things work for all of us. But within that space, there's a lot of room to find out, what your perfect formula is. There's also a lot of room for cultural preferences, personal preferences, even, ethical choices. All of that is part of, individualizing and customizing your diet. You don't want to make the mistake of reducing it all to a physiological level. The problem I have with a lot of the nutritionists out there who have, only one shtick, if you go to sit down with a nutritionist who's all in on the keto thing, for an initial consultation, you say, hey, I've come to you because I'm having a problem with my training, and I think, maybe you can help me fix my diet. That, if it's a keto zealot, that person is probably not going to ask you any questions about your current diet. They're not going to ask you what you like, what you don't like. They're not going to ask you what you think works for you. what you think doesn't work for you, they're just going to simply give you the diet. It's like, forget everything you've done before, start over. This is the diet. And they would go do that for every single client. Like, that's not what you should do. Your approach should be, even if you're open to changing your diet, don't start over. Just tweak, fine tune. Like, actually, you want to change as little as possible because you eat the way you do now for a reason. Presumably you kind of like the way you eat. You're just not happy with the results. So why not, just try to preserve anything that you can preserve in there in terms of the types of foods you like to eat, or, the cultural stuff or the ethical stuff, whatever, and just make the changes you need to make to get the results you want.
Yeah, something radical that also stood out to me from some of your works was the idea about choosing food based upon what you did like, and making sure that you weren't trying to force in things that you hated, and you were leaving in some high quality version of your favorites. Seems pretty obvious when you hear it, but it's not a message you hear commonly.
No, it just, yeah. Yeah, I don't get it. Because I view athletes as human beings, like you have to put the athlete in the context of a human life. And when you do that, I just think, the way you end up going about trying to improve, is just more humane and sane.
And it's going to work better. People are going to have better compliance, and more effect from that. And of the things you mentioned, which do you think is the one that recreational athletes might just completely miss out on the most? Which one is like one of the biggest low-hanging fruits for a lot of recreational athletes to change?
I would go with quality. If it's
okay.
Yeah, if I could only have an athlete make one change, or what the first change would be. I seldom encounter an athlete who is doing all they could with quality. And again, perfection is not the aim, but really it's just unprocessed foods, natural food types, and just so much of what we eat is not that, and just a lot of athletes are a little bit confused. Some rely pretty heavily on energy bars for snacks and think, well, it's a Cliff Bar, not a Snickers, so it's high quality, right? It's like, no. Really.
Still pretty processed.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, it's different, because there are sort of types. You can pretty quickly, if you interview athletes about their diet, you can pretty quickly put them in one or another bucket. And there are those out there who are obsessed with quality, but those folks who are more likely to undereat, for example, because self-restriction comes so easily to them that they over-restrict. So like the quality is great, but they're simply not eating enough. So you sort of have to take it case by case. But if I'm painting with broad brush strokes, I would start with quality.
So this has been awesome. Hugely appreciate your time. I'd really encourage anyone to visit mattfitzgerald.org to connect further with Matt and see more about his work. We're going to have links to his books and more comments from myself. Just any closing words of inspiration or insight, or how would you want to wrap things up for us, Matt?
Yeah, I guess the last thing I would like to say is that, in my experience of just going around the world eating with top athletes, is that, again, this is another one of those things that is almost universal, is that they were all happy with their diet. Like even though their diets are very good, like they enjoyed it. They really were just a matter of habit. Like, this is how I eat. And it may have taken a little work to get there, but I think that's important for people to understand that I think there's thinking that you either eat right or you enjoy eating.
That's funny.
and you really can do both. Sometimes I want to tell athletes, like, my prescription for you is spend 80% less time worrying about food. It's like, well, what else should I change? No, that's it. Just do that. you can have it both ways. Like, honestly, like, if you are not happy with your diet, no matter how textbook it might look, you're not eating right. Like, so, yeah, you should be happy.
That's an awesome, awesome quote. Matt, thanks so much for your time. And those of you with me, thanks for being here with us. And I'll be back with you again real soon. Bye-bye. Hey, Dr. Christensen here. Thanks so much for joining me for another episode. Is there a topic you'd like me to cover? I'd love to hear from you. Just go to Dr. Alan Christensen on Facebook or Instagram, write your question, and use the hashtag #MedicalMyths. Did you find this show helpful? If so, please take a minute and leave us a rating on iTunes so that others can know. Thanks much, and I'll be back with you real soon. Bye-bye.